Forget the crisis in Athens overnight. We have our own emerging Greek tragedy in the ongoing mining tax saga. Now, here's the latest in case you missed recent episodes. The Senate committee into the new revised version of the old super profits tax, now known as Mining Resources Rent Tax, MRRT, pay attention, released its long-awaited report yesterday and called for the whole thing to be axed and start from scratch. Actually, not as surprising as it seems, as the committee was dominated by coalition forces who say they will repeal it if they get into government. But wait a minute, says the villain/hero on the side in the form of the Greens' Bob Brown, who said he doesn't care if the Libs win office, he'll hold the balance of power and there'll be no repealing of this tax, it's here to stay. In fact, he says, I'll raise the stakes and I want an even bigger, tougher tax and more money to come to Australian taxpayers for their resources, not going to the foreigners. In a publicity blitz on the day of the report, the Greens leader claimed some 83% of the mining industry is foreign-owned and will lose some $50 billion of profits offshore in only the next 5 years. This seemed to play into the hands of Twiggy Forrest, who was already screaming over on the other side of the country, home of the miners in Perth, that if this tax went ahead, 100% of our mining industry would be swallowed up by foreigners. He then attacked Bob Brown's comments, which seemed to be saying exactly the same thing. Confused? Take a number, get in line. OK, so you've got all that. Here to put his side is the chairman of the Senate committee report into the MRRT and Coalition Assistant Treasurer, per-report regular, virtually, Senator Mathias Cormann. Welcome back to the show.
Good to be here, Janine.
Well, good to have you finally. We've talked about this report. Can you just sum up? I've seen some of your quotes today. I mean, I'll just say the basics are you want the thing to be axed and start from scratch. You've described this as a train wreck. Just sum up what you've come up with today.
Well, I mean, my committee has looked at this mining tax now in some detail for the last 10 months, and our conclusion is that this is a bad tax which came out of a deeply flawed and improper process. It is a tax which is more complex, which is less fair, which is divisive, which is more distorting than current arrangements, which reduces our international competitiveness, which is of course fiscally reckless, and it's a tax that we don't think should go ahead.
Okay, well, just on that basis, let's go back. You said much the same thing, or the industry and everyone else in the coalition said that about the original tax. They did a deal that watered it down. It seemed to be, it's certainly raising less revenues. So if you didn't like the first one, are you ever going to like any tax if we went back to the drawing board?
Well, we've got to just remember where this whole process started. This whole process was supposed to be about genuine tax reform, delivering a simpler, fairer tax system. And of course, all we've ended up with is a multi-billion-dollar new tax which is imposed on one single industry, an important industry for Australia's economic prosperity. And it's of course a tax which is manifestly more complex and less fair.
Okay.
And the real problem between the original tax and the second version, the original tax was announced without any consultation with anyone. The second version of the tax was, of course, negotiated exclusively and in secret, behind closed doors, between the government and the three biggest mining companies, excluding their competitors, and designing a tax in a way that makes it harder for those smaller and mid-tier companies to compete with the big three, and excluding all state and territory governments from the process.
Okay,
now, state and territory governments are responsible for royalty arrangements today. You can't genuinely reform resource taxation and royalty arrangements without actually at least sitting down with the states and territories as part of the process.
Okay. Just on that, I'll go back to my original question. Quite simply, you've said you want this tax thrown out and start from scratch. But are you, from what you say, you don't want any tax on the mining industry. The miners don't seem to want any. I would have thought the government has a pretty good claim that at least if the top three, who pay the bulk of the tax, are prepared to stump up something, it's better than nothing.
Well, we don't think there should be a tax, an ad hoc tax grab, which is targeted at one single industry. We think that we should look at the tax system as a whole. We think that
they did that, Senator. With respect, they had the Henry tax review. I mean, is this just part of the spoiling of the coalition?
Janine, actually, they didn't. Well, actually, Janine, they didn't do this. They had Ken Henry run a review. That's true. They had Ken Henry and his committee run a comprehensive process, and then they released the Henry tax review report on the same day as they released the government's response. Now, the only part the government responded to at the time was to announce a new tax, which was announced without any consultation whatsoever, either with stakeholders or with state and territory governments. Now, what we should be having is an open, transparent and inclusive process where all stakeholders, not just a select few, have an opportunity to have their say, and where, of course, state and territory governments are also part of that process. You can't simplify taxation arrangements across Australia without actually making sure that you take federal-state financial relations into consideration as part of the equation.
I understand that, but your report was into the MRRT. You say in this report you should start again from scratch, but you also say in the same breath that you don't think there should be a tax grab on the miners as one area. So are you actually saying you don't think there should be any form of mining tax, only something that covers everyone else? That the miners, despite these windfall profits, shouldn't have any special tax on them?
Well, we're not saying they should start from scratch with the mining tax. We're saying the government should start from scratch with tax reform. Now, as far as the mining industry is concerned, we currently have an arrangement in place where the mining companies pay royalties as the price they have to pay for the value of the resource, the non-renewable resource they extract out of the ground, and they pay company tax as a tax on profits. Now, we can have a conversation about whether the current taxation levels are high enough, but the existing taxation framework provides an adequate and appropriate framework to ensure that there is a fair return for the community. And of course it's up to state and territory governments to make a decision as to whether the level of royalties is high enough, and it's up to the federal government to decide whether the level of company tax is high enough. Now, the coalition's perspective is that we should pursue lower taxes, we should pursue simpler and fairer taxes. The problem with this government is that they're so addicted to spending. They have wasted so much money, they've put us into such a terrible budget position with record levels of deficit, record levels of debt, that they are constantly casting around for new taxes, irrespective of the damage that it will do to our economy.
Okay, well, let's look specifically at your report, this particular tax, and what's happened with the Greens now. The Greens have said, Bob Brown's made it clear, I mean, your position in the coalition is if we get in, we'll repeal this tax. He said today, absolutely not. They hold the balance of power. What's your plan B?
Well, Bob Brown is getting very arrogant very quickly, and I can see that he's flexing his muscle now that he's got an additional 4 senators coming into the Senate come 1 July. And I mean, the Australian people should be very, very worried. I mean, Bob Brown is the de facto Deputy Prime Minister. Julia Gillard might be the Prime Minister, but Bob Brown is the one calling the shots. Now, the reality is Bob Brown is making assumptions about the next election result. I would not work on the assumption that the Greens will continue to hold the balance of power beyond the next election. We will be campaigning very strongly against Labor's ad hoc tax grabs. We will be campaigning very strongly for genuine and strategic tax reform, and we are very confident that we will be able to convince the Parliament, should we have the confidence of the Australian people at the next election, to get that through the Parliament.
Big call without a double dissolution, but I want to ask you about something else that Bob Brown said that seems to have struck a chord. He claims today 83% of the industry is foreign owned, and that $50 billion in dividends is going to go offshore in the next 5 years. What do you say to that? Because that's something that would upset many Australians.
Well, I mean, many Australians, of course, understand that a strong mining industry is good for Australia. Many Australians understand that the resources in the ground, undiscovered and unextracted, don't have much value to us at all. In order for us to be able to maximise the opportunities from our mining industry, of course, we have to attract international investment. Of course, we have to have a taxation regime in place that is internationally competitive, so that we can attract investment, so that we can continue to grow our mining industry, which, of course, helps drive our economic prosperity, helps drive jobs, helps drive a lot of benefits that spread through right across the economy. I don't expect Bob Brown to understand this, but Julia Gillard and the Labor government should be much more.
Because you're saying then it's okay to be foreign owned. Because I have to say, Senator Cormann, I've been on a platform with you and I've listened to the push from your colleagues in Western Australia, or your fellow Western Australians. You have quite clearly criticised the fact that they're foreign owned companies that own the bulk of that are involved in this mining tax. There is a really xenophobic attitude, which Rio mentioned today, and you as a West Australian are very much, I've heard you say, these foreign-owned companies.
Look, Janine, I challenge you to find any record anywhere where I use the word foreign-owned companies. I have never used that language. The language that I do use is that I think it is highly inappropriate for the government to sit down with three multinational, multi-commodity and multi-project companies and negotiate the design of a new tax exclusively with them, excluding all of their competitors from the process, and designing the tax in such a way that makes it harder for those companies that were excluded from the process to compete with those larger multinational, multi-commodity, multi-project companies.
So I just want to be clear, you don't agree with the extremes of the extreme people in Western Australia who do stand on platforms, the Clive Palmers and people who knock these companies as being foreign-owned. You don't agree with that?
Well, I can't speak for Clive Palmer, but my point is this. BHP, Rio and Xstrata are very important companies that are making a great contribution to the Australian economy. My point is, and of course they were appropriately part of the process, my criticism is that they shouldn't have been exclusively part of the process. Just imagine if the government sat down with Coles and Woolworths and designed a tax for the whole retail sector and said to IGA and all the way down to the smallest corner store retail shop, you're not going to be part of the process, but you're going to have to live by this tax. It's going to be harder for you to compete with Coles and Woolworths moving forward, but we are not going to consult you as part of the process. And not only that, to add insult to injury, we're going to ask the former chairman of Coles or Woolworths to chair the implementation committee, which will make sure that the tax is really designed in such a fashion that you will find it harder to compete.
Twiggy Forrest said today that if the tax went through, even more of the industry will become foreign-owned. Does that concern you, or as the party of free enterprise, does it not matter if 100% of the companies are foreign-owned?
Well, I'm concerned about the fact that the MRRT, the way it has been designed by Julia Gillard and Wayne Swan, gives an unfair competitive advantage to one section of the industry. It gives an unfair competitive advantage to the large multinational, multi-commodity, multi-project mining companies. My point is this. An Australian government, I mean, those companies, of course, quite appropriately went into this process trying to do the best for their shareholders. But the Australian government should have acted in the public interest, not in the best interest of the shareholders of those companies. And of course, the Australian government should have gone through an open, transparent and inclusive process where the whole industry would have had an opportunity to have their say, rather than just the CEOs of the big three.
Can I just ask one final question, which was always something very odd and very disturbing about your process in the Senate committee? You called Don Argus, the chairman of BHP, a critical player in this, and he didn't come to give evidence. I mean, what does that say to you?
Well, I mean, I think that is very regrettable. I mean, our committee clearly thought that it was in the public interest for Don Argus to give evidence. Don Argus, as the immediate past chairman of BHP, one of the three big mining companies that sat around the table exclusively with the government, was asked by the government to help them implement a very controversial tax. We had some questions to ask him about the reasons behind his recommendations, about his assessment of the mining tax the way it now stands. He refused to make himself available, given that his position was actually a taxpayer-funded position. We thought that the Senate committee was quite entitled to hear his evidence, and we're very disappointed that he didn't make himself available. People can make their own judgments about the fact that he declined to appear.
And they will, no doubt. And now, I'm sure we haven't heard the end of this, and we'll talk to you in the coming weeks to see what happens next in this saga.
Always happy to come and talk to you about this.
Thank you, Senator Mathias Cormann over in Perth. And